Alrighty, now authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is it is related to totalitarianism, but it's not as total. Authoritarianism is the same principles, so we measure it in terms of the same principles. Citizen representation and citizen rights and liberties are both very unimportant in an authoritarian society. Yeah. But not as unimportant as in a totalitarian society. A totalitarian society is extreme, controls everything. Stalin's Soviet Union was a totalitarian society. It's gone now. Vladimir Putin's Russia is easily an authoritarian society. There's a lot going on in Russia that Putin's government cannot completely control. There's been protests breaking out in Russia more and more. Belarus, right there on the Russian border leading into Europe, is an authoritarian society, not a totalitarian society. There's been a bunch of protests there recently. Citizens are standing up, they're going out into the streets, and they're not getting massacred by the government, although the government's doing scary things to the protesters. So they're very authoritarian, very powerful elite controls Belarus right now. It's a hot point in global politics. Russia. We're seeing less protests in Russia, but we do see protests in Russia. So the Russian government of Putin, authoritarian, doesn't care much about representation. The elections over there are probably not that fair. Not fair. I would just say not fair. We're going to talk more about Russia, Russia's view and involvement in the United States, a really current issue. We've got more time in the semester to talk about that. I'd like to hear all your views on many of these things, and we're going to explore those in the discussion section, and then I'm going to read them, and I'm going to incorporate a lot of that as much as I can into the videos. Now, so authoritarian Russia these days, that's an example. Rights and liberties don't matter as much, but they're not totalitarian. They are not completely able to suppress dissent. They're not completely able to suppress a free press. There's citizen involvement and pressure against the elite rule of Belarus and the elite rule of Russia. So two authoritarian societies. So they're authoritarian because they do what totalitarianism does, but to a lesser extent. Yeah, classic examples, a lot of Latin American countries, not so much these days. There's a big trend toward liberal democracy, but to a certain extent still, there's a legacy of authoritarianism in Latin America. You never really saw totalitarianism in Latin America that I can think of. There might be an exception, but even communist Latin American countries, you got Latin American dictatorships divided into two groups: on the right, on the philosophical right, and on the philosophical left. And the left would be the communist extreme, and the right would be some kind of family dynasty, military dictatorship, or something like that. So Latin American countries, you see authoritarianism, and you saw that for much of the 20th century. You saw a lot of authoritarianism and really not a lot of totalitarianism there, for one big reason. There was a huge area of life and culture in Latin America that's very important, that the political system could never really wrap its hands around. It could never really gain complete control over the citizenry, because there was a competing source of cultural power in Latin America that remains there today, and that is the Catholic Church, very religious, Central and South America, everywhere from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. The Catholic Church is a very powerful cultural institution, and that was the way in the 20th century, and that was still the way today. It's lessening. It's lessening more. All around the world, you see a shift toward the liberal democratic model. Yeah, but very gradually, very gradually. So, even the worst military dictators in Latin America in the 20th century, and even the harshest communist regimes in Latin America, they had a major challenge confronting the power and influence and the allegiance of the Catholic Church. And that's why we call them authoritarian. So just like Belarus in Russia today, they're powerful elite governments where representation, citizens' interests don't matter that much. There's not a lot of democracy, or not a lot of fair democracy. And also, citizen rights and liberties don't matter all that much. That's authoritarianism. Yeah. Alrighty. Now we use those. We talk about anarchism. We talk about authoritarianism. We talk about totalitarianism. We use those as we don't have. That's not describing our political system. In what I think is the fairest. You can always find some fringe so-called expert who will say, no, we really are authoritarian. But I don't think that is a fair or factually based diagnosis. I think it's more based on fact and more fair to the reality to describe the American political system as a liberal democracy. That's only one term, and we're gonna introduce that key term. We can equate that with a constitutional democracy. It is a republic. It's a constitutional republic. It is a representative democracy. A representative democracy, a republic, a constitutional republic, a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy. With those terms, we really got a lot of overlap. Alrighty? So, we're doing basic concepts right now. Basic concepts. So let's talk about these. The one that I use the most is liberal democracy throughout the semester. And we should always ask ourselves, are we becoming more liberal democratic or less liberal democratic? It's a fascinating question. And like I said, I want to repeat the line I said just a couple minutes ago. You always find some fringe so-called experts or so that say, no, we're really an authoritarianism society. I don't think the facts bear that out. We see a competitive, more than ever, we see a very competitive political sphere where votes matter, at least votes in swing states matter. So we do see a lot of impact of the vote, of the ballot box. We see politics surrounding who's going to vote by what methods and what strategies might be preventing certain groups of people from voting. Voting does matter. Voting is not the only thing that matters by any means. There's elite power. So there's a mixture. It's not as simple as one or the other. There's a mixture of people power and representation, and elite power and big money and connections, and so it's a mixture. But a liberal democracy, I think, is the best term for this, and that's where there is a relatively high degree of representation, and there is at the same time a relatively high degree of respect for rights and liberties of citizenry. So that contrasts it conceptually with the anarchy, the totalitarianism, and the authoritarianism. Alrighty, and in fact, a constitutional monarchy. Just to round out our. We're not a constitutional monarchy. Canada is, and you really think how similar Canada is to the United States. Culturally very similar. We expect a lot of the same things from government as Canada, and there are some interesting cultural differences between Canada and the United States, but that's a constitutional monarchy. It's basically the same thing. Monarch doesn't have any power. It's a liberal democracy with a titular monarch, in title only, on monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. She's Queen of Canada. She's Queen of England, she's Queen of Canada, she's Queen of New Zealand, she's Queen of Australia, etc. Those are all constitutional monarchies, and they're all liberal democracies like we are. Some of them may be doing better at the liberal democracy thing. Some of them may be doing worse. It's a fascinating question. We don't have time to go into it right now, but we can, And I hope to structure the discussion so that they're going to be hopefully more free flowing. Like if you have a concept that I haven't prompted you to talk about, you could go ahead and try to start convo about that. All right. So that's liberal democracy, a relatively high degree of importance placed upon representation of citizens' interests, and a relatively high degree of importance based upon rights and liberties. That's so central, so philosophically central to the American experience. How so? Liberal democracy means this, to put it in other words, majority rule with minority rights. Now, you don't have to worry about majority rights, whatever majority that could be. Majorities shift, and on different issues there are different majorities, right? But just to make it simple, the definition, the nutshell definition of liberal democracy is majority rule but minority rights. Representation matters, minorities have rights and liberties that can't be trampled by the majority. That's heart and soul and central to the institutions of American government. Not so in many places in the world, and we see transition and we see development within that. We see development within that theme in America, yeah, and we see development towards that theme or in that theme in other countries. And that seems to be a pretty general, broad picture of politics in America and in other countries as well. So liberal democracy, majority rules, representation matters, minority rights and liberties, can't be trampled by majority. That's how it's supposed to work. Didn't work that way in many cases we've got to talk about. But we're looking at the kind of a theoretical ideal, which is actually in many ways real, but not completely. Liberal democracy, majority rule, minority rights. Alrighty. So I think we don't need to go into contrast with authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I think we can kind of see that from the way we've defined them, how they are different. Republican and Democrat. Republican and Democrat. These are names of the two political parties. Let's define them in the kind of real sense, and then they're just attached. They're just coincidentally, they're attached to parties. Yeah. The Democrat Party is no more democratic than the Republican Party. The Republican Party is no more Republican in the technical sense than the Democrat Party. All right, so we're going to start the next segment with that.